What's going on, folks? Ted from Immersion here, and apparently we have a new video from the folks at Dungeons and Dragons. This talking about the results of the Druid and a Paladin survey for the Unearthed Arcana that closed. That was the previous one, Unearthed Arcana 4. I've already heard from some of you that people are having all sorts of hot debates and interesting conversations about what's being discussed in here. I don't know. I haven't watched it yet. It is a 14-minute video, so I think we might watch it at a little bit of an increased speed, maybe like 1.25, 1.5 times speed. We'll see. That way we can get through it quicker so the video doesn't slog on for too long. I'm hoping that we're going to see Wild Shape go back to some way that it was previously, because we all know people were not a huge fan of that. And I'm wondering what they're going to do to smites, because I bet you they're going to remove ranged smiting, because it just makes the paladin better in every way than the ranger, really, in my opinion. I liked it, though. I would have kept it, personally, but we'll see what happens. All right, let's go ahead and we will watch here.
Recently, we've been able to look at the results for Unearthed Arcana about the Paladin and the Druid. What did we find out?
So this survey, again, got tons of responses. So first off, thank you to everyone who filled out what I know is a long survey, and it is worth it because this feedback is so informative for how we proceed with the design of each of these classes, each of these subclasses, and the rules and other elements that are present in this playtest. So what we learned with the Druid and the Paladin is super informative. I'll start with the Paladin. The Paladin overall did extremely well in terms of satisfaction. So we saw with the Paladin that every single feature in the class, as well as in the subclass, scored 70% or higher.
Wow.
In the base class, the lowest scoring thing was Divine Smite, and that was at 72%. And for anyone who hasn't been with us for one of these videos before, we consider 70% or higher to be passing. Now, that doesn't mean it's fine as is. We're always iterating and seeing how can we make this more fun, make this better. But it's telling that in the Paladin, that was the floor. And the scores then went up in a number of cases up into the high 80s, close to 90% satisfaction. And so what that, from a quantitative standpoint, tells us is the overall mood about the playtest Paladin was positive. Now, that's only part of the story, because the qualitative feedback we get, the written feedback, is critical. And so as we began digging into the feedback, and members of the team are continuing to ponder different aspects of it, we see a number of things there. Like one, for example, is many people really loved the addition with Divine Smite of being able to punch smite.
Yes.
But there is a fair amount of resistance to paladins being able to smite on ranged attacks. And actually the resistance is not surprising, because it's about class identity. And class identity is important to all of us who...
Let me smite with a javelin. Let me smite with a bow. Honestly, just get rid of ranger as a class if you're going to do it, though, really. I mean, honestly. Be an Aegis Paladin and smite at range and be the best ranger you can be.
Who really love a particular class, and there are a fair number of people who feel like there's a bridge too far, that Paladins being that effective at ranged attacks starts making them feel like clerics when compared to another divine spellcaster, and even starting to move into ranger territory.
Yeah, there it is.
So that's feedback we take seriously.
I get it.
Because sometimes, even
I don't like
if
it,
the
but I
math
get it.
of the game tells us it's okay to do a particular thing, in D&D, that's only part of the story, because so often it's the narrative that's the most persuasive. It's the identity of something that really captures our imagination. And a lot of commenters on the Paladin bring up that for them, the Paladin, and they're not wrong, has traditionally been a melee class.
I get it. I really do. I 100% understand. I'm not surprised. I was okay with it. I would still likely be playing our melee Paladin anyway. It just means in the opportunity that I needed to do some kind of range damage. I never have had the interest in playing, and then I'm not saying that like you couldn't. Obviously, you could be a bow-based Paladin with that, and smite with a longbow, let's say, and build a Dex Paladin. I personally have never. I've played in the times that I've played 5th edition. I think I've played 7 Paladins, and I probably only played maybe 10, 12 characters total over since the history, since 5e started. So Paladins are clearly my favorite class. Again, in this edition, I never touched Paladins or had any interest in them in previous editions. It's just 5th edition. And I never once went down the route of a dexterity-based Paladin. I hear good things. but it was never for me, so I likely would have been a heavy armor wearing melee paladin. I just would have had a little bit of ranged opportunity there. I guess now they do get cantrips, so you will get some ranged capabilities now that you previously would not have. But either way, like I said, I get it, and I don't love it, but it's ultimately not my choice, right? It's the populace as a whole says no. Maybe you make a magic item or a feat that allows your paladins to do it in your game if you want to do that.
Also, a lot of great specific feedback about other details in particular features of the class, and a lot of positive response to the redesigned smite spells. And in fact, people were wanting to see the new versions of the smite spells possibly integrated into the class more. And that is something we will be exploring in the next version of the Paladin.
Interesting.
Of just as we did in the recent Mage playtest, look at giving the Paladin some of these spells as Paladin exclusives.
Oh.
Because many people, understandably, associate those spells just with
the
that
paladin,
class.
yeah.
Now, the Druid was another story. And you and I have talked in another video about we knew that the Druid response was going to be mixed. We knew this for historical reasons. In the playtest Druid, we tested out a different version of Wild Shape that relied on these generalized templates rather than specific beast stat blocks. It's something we tried 10 years ago in D&D Next, received a mixed response, so we didn't go in that direction. But then in the 2021 Player's Handbook survey that we did, we saw quite a few people asking for a design direction like that. So we decided to give it another go. But we knew, because past is prologue, there was a higher than zero chance that it wouldn't be the direction that the majority of Druid fans wanted us to go in. And sure enough, we are seeing that in the feedback to Wild Shape, there are basically two camps. There are people who have written in the comments, and I'm looking at the written report here that our staff provided with me, with quotes from fans saying this is their favorite version of Wild Shape they've ever seen, paired with people who, in contrast, said they never want this Wild Shape to appear in print. And the people in that second group outnumbered the people in the previous group, although it wasn't a huge sort of runaway thing. It was like, it's similar to when we think about the number of groups that use feats and the number of groups that don't. It's just a simple majority. You know, it's like just over the line of 50%.
Okay, couple of things there. So, not surprising. This one goes back to my video that I released last week about playtests, which is this also being part of the reason why I have made that video. Because what are you looking to do with this playtest, right? Are you looking to tweak things a little bit, or are you seemingly what Wizards of the Coast is occasionally doing here, where you're swinging for the fences and trying something really out of whack, different than what people are used to see, because maybe if enough people, the open majority, say, hey, no, we like this Wild Shape with the templates, that it becomes the new societal norm, and that's what you choose to do. And it sounds like they knew going in. Same thing they mentioned when they had removed critical hits for monsters. Like, they knew it would be controversial, but they wanted to just give it a try. And apparently they were going off of some data from that big survey in 2021 where they reevaluated the player's handbook. And I guess people were suggesting something like that. Another thing I do want to call out is that they are doing I'd say Jeremy's doing a pretty good job here of, again, we talked about transparency post OGL situation about wanting to make sure that, like, we can see that you're using the surveys and that the information and the data is, like, it's not just, you're not just taking the percentages, right? 70% plus, good, stamp it, good, we're going to go forward, maybe a little bit of tweaking. We're hearing about the written feedback that people are giving, that there are, like, even if things are doing well, like, again, for example, the Paladin is a great example, right? The smites were received well numerically, but the written comments said we like smite the way it is, we just don't like the ranged smite aspect of it. Shows that they are actually actively looking at what people are saying and using that to hopefully iterate on in a positive way. We haven't seen, this is something that I guess we are kind of in a weird space where we haven't seen, with the exception of the races which are now species, we haven't seen them reiterate on anything like class based. So we haven't seen, like, a revamp of the rogue, bard, and ranger, or things like that, to see like, hey, you took all the feedback in, let's see how that translates into a new version. We have not seen that yet. But they're bringing it up here that they're looking to, the majority of people are saying no, but they are saying they've seen feedback of both sides. And I also thought it's interesting that they're bringing up feats again, because again, the conversation 4 years ago, right around this time that I'd had with Jeremy Crawford at a D&D live event, was that most people don't use feats in their game, so they weren't really looking to add new feats to the game at that point. And that was why for a while we weren't really getting much in the way of new feats, even though there were several feat-based Unearthed Arcanas. So I guess it sounds like we're at like a 51-49% or somewhat near to that. But I'm a little surprised if that's how close the schism or the split was on the Druid, because my general, from what I had seen from comments, from posts on other, social medias, most people were very much not in favor of the changes they made to the Druid.
So in many ways, this is ending up where you and I talked about it probably would end up in one of our other videos, when we were sort of prognosticating
Yeah.
how might the wild shape feedback go. And really where it's going is people love the texture and differences that are present among the different beast options in the 2014 wild shape. But even the people who like that form of wild shape are open to the feature being a bit easier to use. Because as you and I have discussed in a video about the Druid, making wild shape easier to use, that's our main goal here.
Yeah.
We're not actually wedded to a specific implementation in terms of like the exact stat blocks that are being used. Our main goal is just simply, we no longer want to be asking a brand new player or even a veteran player who's strapped for time to go ponder 100 stat blocks and
Right.
decide which one they're going to turn into. And so that's what we will work on solving. And the next time the Druid appears in Unearthed Arcana, everyone is going to get to see an entirely different take when it comes to wild shape that addresses the feedback that we got here.
So that's interesting. I don't know. To me, sorting through the stat blocks and stuff, that's part and parcel to the Druid. Like that's, I don't know. I have mixed feelings on this. Maybe I should make a separate video. I don't know, but I haven't played a Druid in 5e, just being completely honest with you, but I've run games for several Druids over the past 10 years. And some of them, this was their first time playing Dungeons and Dragons or a role-playing game of any kind at all. And they jumped in feet first, head first, however you want to consider it, with a Druid as their starter class. A Moon Druid, no less, as their starter class. And they didn't seem to have any problems figuring that out. And I've had other instances where people have done that. And then for, my first character that I ever played in Dungeons and Dragons was a Druid in 3rd edition. And again, maybe that's because I have more of a gamery mindset. I don't know. I really don't know. But I never have come across somebody in my experience. Again, please sound off in the comments and let me know if your experience has been different. That the stat block aspect of sorting through multiple stat blocks and having different forms to turn into was such a turnoff for people that they either only stuck to a singular form or they just never wild shaped at all. Yeah, in my experience, people will likely have, like, you have the entire, all of the stat blocks, right? But, and you might have like you could call them signature forms, right? Like more often than not, we get into a combat situation, giant scorpion. That's what I'll turn into, right? Or something. But it's like, what if we need to do? Okay, if we're gonna fly, yeah, sure, I'll do giant eagle. That makes the most sense. If we're gonna go underwater, yeah, hunter shark or whatever it is. But there might be instances where it's like, you know what? I'm gonna turn into a horse right now. And I'll turn into a war horse because of whatever. I guess in theory, everything that I'm suggesting to you based on just what I described could be solved with the stat block concept that they were going for. But my point is, I never really had an issue or have experienced issues where it being a big, like, people were just having decision paralysis of too many stat blocks to choose. And like I said, I've run 2 campaigns that went to like from 1 to like 17, 18, both with druids in them, and it was never a problem. So I don't understand where that's coming from. But I think what we all agreed on was the lack of hit points, temporary hit points or otherwise, felt a little odd. And you lose a lot of the flavor of like, hey, this creature has a burrow speed, this one has blind sight, this one has keen senses, or whatever it is. There was a little more flavor to the creature you chose, which would make it like, oh, I'll choose to play a crab because a crab has blind sight, or a bat as opposed to an owl or like whatever. And that gave you a little more variability there. But that's just me. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts.
Now, in the Druid feedback, most of it wasn't about wild shape, but we did see some interesting commentary about other things that we were exploring in the Unearthed Arcana. One of those was people really liked the promise of channel nature, this idea of using what was formerly just uses of wild shape for more than wild shape, which is actually something we've already been doing in Druid design for a while. In Tasha's Cauldron of Everything had subclasses where the Druid could use wild shape for something other than wild shaping.
Yeah.
Yes.
Channel nature is just that with a different name. But as much as people like the promise of channel nature, the feedback is they'd like to see us do more with it. I love that kind of feedback. If essentially the feedback is, we're not super happy with the version here, but we like it, so please give us more with the following feedback. We will
I fall into
absolutely
that
do
camp for sure.
Now, the feedback on the Circle of the Moon Druid, very interesting feedback. Some of it I expected, and some of it I didn't. I came to the feedback wondering, for instance, is there going to be a lot of requests for being able to turn into elementals again, since that was a function, just as one example, in the 2014 Circle of the Moon Druid. The piece that surprised me is that that was not a major theme, but rather people wanted us to go a little further in the redesign to really lean into sort of the lunar aesthetic of the subclass. In other words, it was people wanting the subclass to be a bit more internally coherent. And also, when it comes to wild shape, desiring for the forms to be resilient so that the Circle of the Moon Druid can continue to function in melee without being afraid of being squashed too easily. We hear that feedback. We will absolutely respond to it, while at the same time not bringing back the runaway power that the Circle of the Moon Druid could have at high levels in the 2014 version.
What made that a runaway power?
So one of the main reasons is that at high level the Druid got unlimited uses of wild shape, which for the Circle of the Moon Druid meant unlimited hit point recharges, because every time you entered a new form, it meant you got all of the hit points of that form. But even before you got unlimited versions of wild shape, you had enough uses of wild shape and enough forms you could turn into with large hit point pools that it made it very difficult for dungeon masters to make Circle of the Moon Druids feel threatened in any way, because of this ability to just essentially hit the wild shape button and sometimes get more hit points than the Druid themselves had. And so that will be reined in however the Circle of the Moon subclass ends up, and as we go through the feedback. And that will be a common theme with some of the things that we do. We will absolutely incorporate as much feedback as we can, but there are going to be some places where things simply, the balance needs to be corrected. And this is one of those places we talked when talking about the sorcerer, that like Twin Spell is an example of something that needed its power adjusted. What's cool is there aren't actually that many things like that. Most things power-wise are where we want them to be, and it's much more about finding ways in which we can make them even more fun, even more true to the identity of the class or subclass, and where possible, seeing how we can make them even easier to use.
Isn't necessarily applicable to the survey results, but you mentioned like you don't want a class to necessarily eat someone else's lunch. Like the Paladin, some people notice that maybe being able to smite with a ranged weapon kind of intruded on kind of the theme and feeling of the Ranger. Is that true for subclasses as well? Because we've got something like the Arcane Archer for fighters that's got a little bit like, okay, I'm a pretty good archer, I'm kind of in the range of a Ranger, kind of.
So subclasses, by their very nature, are meant to give you either a taste of something that no class has, or they're meant to give you a taste of something that's in another class. So it's actually intentional in subclass design.
Interesting that that's part of subclass design. We've seen it, right, where you have this is the cleric-y sorcerer, but interesting to hear them come out and say it.
That occasionally a class, through that subclass, will get the feel of another class in the game. We don't do that with every subclass, but that absolutely is the goal with some of them. The main thing we don't want to do is have base classes that are eating too much of each other's lunches. Even though there is a lot of shared tech and story among the classes. Like an example of this is we have multiple classes who have the fighting style feature, for instance, and it's appropriate for each of the classes that have it. But then we made sure that each of the classes that have that shared feature have other things that those classes alone have. For instance, of the classes that have the fighting style feature, only the Paladin has lay on hands.
Right.
Only the Hunter has, I'm sorry, the Ranger, not the Hunter subclass, but the Ranger class. Only the Ranger class has their favorite enemy mechanics.
And there's a little bit of history of like also like when you have Eldritch Knight, this is kind of like the fighter mage, and the Blade Singer, which is the fighter mage, but more mage than fighter.
Yep.
That kind of like connective tissue between two, maybe even opposite classes.
Yeah, exactly. And those two are prime examples of a subclass that is intentionally giving you some of the feel of a class that is other than the one that contains that subclass. Yeah, because Eldritch Knight gives you a sampling of Wizard, and Blade Singer gives the Wizard a sampling of Fighter.
All right, so yeah, I get the concept of not having. So hearing that explanation, it makes a little more sense. Again, the concept of not wanting to have the Paladin smite at range because the base class, it's a base class thing. Perhaps, which could be interesting, there is a ranged smiting subclass in theory, right? I doubt it, but that could be an interesting way to go about it. Like, that's the identity of the subclass. It allows you to smite at range, which, according to their own design philosophy, is that certain subclasses give you a taste of what it is like for another class. Again, the great example brought there was the Eldritch Knight and the Blade Singer kind of being the wizardy fighter or the fightery wizard. And I think I still think we need more. The Ranger still needs help, I think, is ultimately where we're at, right? They've done a pretty good job, I think, to start to give identity to things like the Sorcerer by giving them the Sorcerer's kind of new vibe is versatility of damage, right? I think the Wizard was already fine the way it was with its it had the versatility of the spell casting with ritual spells in the spell book and all that stuff. They've gone further to then tap more into the concept of wizards altering spells and making them their own with the new modify and create spell, as well as just the versatility of swapping spells out with something like a memorize spell. And then we see the sorcerer has access to a lot more spells that are unique to them, where the damage type is something that they get to choose, and a lot of little interesting things like that. I think the warlock it's in an interesting spot. It has the invocation concept, which is nice, which are kind of just like, again, more freebie kind of spells. But I don't know. It still feels a little wonky to me. But I think ultimately where we still land is with the Ranger still doesn't really feel like it has a great identity to itself, in my opinion. I think everybody else has something seemingly unique to them and sort of a unique what's the word, archetype, if you will, role, I guess identity, right? Your barbarian is your typically physically strong, resilient melee fighter. Not that they have to be, because they don't necessarily have to be, but your rager, your berserkery type, right? Your bard is your, again, doesn't have to be, but your support class has a little bit of offense, a little bit of defense. It has the little bit of the skill management aspect, but has the inspiration mechanic, which can be used in a variety of ways. The cleric, again, traditionally more of your healery type, but your divine priest mage type. Druid, your nature magic wielder, one in tune with nature, the shapeshifter as well, right? Your fighter is your kind of straight man, really good master now, especially with the new stuff, the master of all weapons, and the ability to use those weapons in different ways than other people, which is, again, something new they've kind of added with the weapon mastery concept. Then you have the monk, which is kind of your master of the martial arts, using their body as a weapon. You finding interesting ways to move around the battlefield, being more light and able to move around, and possibly, again, run on walls and do all sorts of interesting stuff. Again, like a fighter can still fight unarmed, but this is your master of the martial arts unarmed fighter type. Paladin is your holy warrior, right? They have divine magic, but they can also bring down the wrath of whatever entity that they worship to cause extra damage. Again, with your divine smite. Your rogue is your sneaky thief type, but also is able to pinpoint and do precision damage with things like sneak attack. You have your sorcerer, which again, they're kind of tapping into this concept of wild inborn magic, the ability to do all sorts of things and have their magic be more elemental based in nature, but switch it up when it suits them best. The wizard being your classically trained studying of books, kind of, knowledge of old magic. And again, the warlock is still in like a weird spot, but the ranger is supposed to be this like, you have the druid, which kind of steps on the ranger's toes in some aspects, but this is supposed to be your, your naturey fighter type, your nature warrior. And I still feel like favored enemy mechanic is so bland as it stands right now, with just like giving you the hunter's mark with no concentration. It just doesn't stack up to Divine Smite. Not saying that you need to basically mimic Divine Smite in every way. I'm still going to stand by. I think an animal companion as the base class feature is the way to go. I truly believe that. I think, it's hit points would have to be its limiting factor, right? And you're giving up part of your turn to do it. But you think about Divine Smite and how much damage it can be used to pump into the the attacks of the Paladin. You give a ranger an animal companion that could possibly do some little bits of damage here and there. It may be on par with the paladin's damage output, and you have this, but like you still have to sacrifice something like your bonus action to be able to utilize the attack of your animal companion, unless you're a beast master, which would probably have an animal companion with like boosted stats of some kind. It's not going to have a ton of hit points, so like it might be risky to send it into combat, but it's a thing you can do. So I think that still feels like that would give you the best identity. Personally, that's how I feel, but I don't know. I always seem to end up, no matter what I do, I end up coming back around to talking about the ranger. No matter how hard I try to avoid it, I still somehow end up coming back around to talk about how I think they should add animal companion as a base feature to ranger. But anyway, but that's also like a traditional fantasy like archetype trope identity, right? The pet class, right? Everybody knows that, right? You play an MMO or something like that, you've got all these other classes, and it's which one's the pet class? Oh, the ranger is the pet class. And then it should be like, do you want to focus on more of your woodsy stuff, your naturey stuff, your weapony stuff, or your pet? And that would be the Beastmaster Ranger would be how you focus on your pet, and it makes your pet stronger. That's like your skill tree. It seems, I don't know, works for me. I don't know. Anyway, let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. I'll see you all next time.